I want to thank MMTV for coming and live broadcasting for everyone at home. It's cold. You're nice and cozy, I hope, and here for our discussion tonight. I also want to thank all the elected officials who did come out to be here in person and those who are watching at home. We thank you for your time and your service. I also want to thank Ward, my new friend, and the Transparency Initiative Committee who did ask for this conversation to happen tonight. I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm happy to have been asked to be a part of this first dialogue around in this calendar year around this topic in this important time. And so I wanted to just set a few expectations of what we're going to do tonight insofar as a format. So we are here, dearly beloved, we are gathered here tonight to be a part of a dialogue, an actual live conversation with three people who love Melrose. I am your party host. The Transparency Initiative group did put this event together, so this is their format. There will be, unfortunately at this time, no audience questions or cheers or boos. If you decide that you would like to participate or we don't answer any questions, we will help facilitate another time, or please call your own conversation in this town. So the Transparency Initiative did solicit questions beforehand, which I have and I will be referring to. And again, we are live on MMTV and YouTube, broadcasting to the world. So welcome to tonight's dialogue. Insert applause here. Thank you. Okay. So we would like to discuss the here and now. Where are we right now? We are going to try to focus on not so much to focus on the past process, unless it is for clarification of where we can go in the future. We have our school administrator right here to answer questions of what the actual process is, what his experience has been like, and thank you for coming, Jason. And we'd like to discuss the topic together to move this community forward, even just this one step tonight. So, who is here, if you can indulge me at home? It is so good to see everybody who came out tonight. If you could do me a favor and just actually, the lights are on, so turn around, well, it's not as creepy to do that, and actually look at who is here tonight, because I think it's really important to see who came out for this conversation, who came out to be a part of this dialogue around something important in Melrose. Thank you. Okay, look, you can wave to people. Good job. Thank you. Hey, everybody. So, sorry to the folks at home. I'll try to describe what I see. Raise your hand and keep your hand up if you have lived in Melrose for 50 years or more. In the back. Okay, great. Keep your hand up. If you've lived here for 30 years or more. If you live here for 15 years or more, keep your hands up. Everybody keep your hands up. 5 years or more. Great. Does everybody see everybody else? Keep your hands up, please, if you don't mind. Who plans on staying in Melrose for 5 years or more? Another 20 years. Oh, we got some hands going down. Where are you going, Florida? 50 years. 50 years or more. Who's going to stay in Melrose forever? Yes. Yes. Oh. Me too, me too. And since this panel is about identity and what Melrose means and what Melrose High School means, who's a parent of a student in the Melrose Public School system? Who's a graduate of the Melrose High School? Are you guys looking around at each other? Yeah, there you are. Who's neither? Who just cares because they care? Yes. Oh, good, we got a bunch. Okay, great. That was about 50% of the crowd is either in Melrose, went to Melrose High School, or has a kid in Melrose Public Schools. So who is not here after you've just looked around? As in the people not in the audience or sitting at this table on this panel right now. And regardless of the presumptions of why they're not here, I just wanted to take a moment to note that those voices will not be heard. But with that said, why are we here? So I'm here tonight because I love Melrose, and as I said, I'm never leaving. Over the past several years, I've noticed a divisive, toxic, vicious cycle of conversation amongst each other, and it makes me really sad. It breaks my heart. We quickly pick sides, whether you're for this or you're for that, and there's nothing in between. We haven't been able to have live, actual conversations, live dialogue in a very long time because we're in a global pandemic, and so it's hard to physically be together. And I believe that we can disagree and still respect and build trust again if we do more of this stuff. So, and we have to, because we all live in these 4.8 square miles together. We are all neighbors. And as we just saw, no one's leaving anytime soon except for these two ladies in the middle. So, for me, this is one topic. The first one where we're here tonight together. We have so many more, and we will always have so many to come. But this is our first step in ending this vicious cycle to a constructive cycle of conversation. I invite you to join us in being in a constructive conversation. Now take a moment and think, why are you here? And why are you watching at home? And what... Thank you for watching at home. But what brings you here? And so I'm going to turn it to our guests. I'm their guest, actually. First up is Ward Hamilton. And Ward, if you could just tell us, why are you here tonight?
Thanks, Sam. Is this working? Okay,
Yes.
Great. So I want to thank Sam, and it was interesting when she was asking who's going to be here for 50 years after this, and if I can get that plot in Wyoming Cemetery, I think I'll be here. Well, unless I live to 100, but you know, it's fine. First off, I want to thank Principal Jason Merrill. I've known Jason for many years. Jason was younger than me coming through school. He was just a little bit behind my brother in school, and I know he's a good man. He's a great man. We're so privileged to have him as a principal, and I can't think of anybody who I'd rather have at the helm here. And in the years that I served on the high school site council, I got to know Jason pretty well, and I know how genuinely his passion is and his care for the kids in this community. So it was no small thing to start this initiative, right, which counters Jason's move, or Jason's initiative of his own in August to take on the topic of the school mascot or nickname. It's no small thing, but I feel very strongly that a conversation needs to take place in this community. The history is not an uncomplicated one, and everyone in this room is probably aware of the fact that the name of our mascot, the Raiders or the Red Raiders, it didn't start with a connection or a connotation to Native Americans. In fact, there was probably about a 2-decade period before 1955 when we see the use of Native American symbolism in Melrose High School and many other communities in the Northeast. And that took place for many years, off and on. And before I get too hot and heavy, let me apologize. Before this started, I had a brief PowerPoint presentation, and I had said to Sam the other day, I said, who's ever seen a PowerPoint go off without a hitch? Well, we didn't figure it out. Technical support that we paid for wasn't here, but that's okay. So I think everyone here is relatively familiar with the history, and so that's not a significant issue. But to go back to what I was saying a moment ago, Melrose High School used an emblem, which is the block M, similar to what Michigan uses. And we see that in photographs, particularly with sports teams, in the late 19th century, and that continues off and on to this present day. Sometime in the 1920s, sports writers started to refer to Melrose sports teams by their school colors, the red or the red and the white. And at some point in the mid-1930s, sports writers for the pre-press started to call Melrose the Raiders or the Red Raiders. Simultaneously, they started to call Malden the Tornadoes, and Medford the Mustangs, and similar nicknames for other schools. So it was sort of a loose thing, right, the way that this nickname started. At or about 1955, particularly we see in the Melrose High School log, the use of Native American symbolism. The practice, which today we call cultural appropriation, at that time was, it wasn't given that label. But over the years, the use of symbolism changed. It was a loose, I would describe it as being very loose. During World War II, there's a connection to a bomber squadron. I think I would say that it started somewhat coincidentally in that the gentleman that was the colonel of that bomber squadron they named his group the Red Raiders. Melrose High School students took that on as, I guess, a patriotic move, or what you might imagine as being some sort of a war support effort. And then clearly at a later time, like I said, in 1955, at the height of pop culture, cowboys and Indians, we start to see in Melrose High School the use of Native American symbolism, people dressing up in costume, and then it gets a little bit different. By the time Bruce McPherson started as the Melrose football head coach around 1981, he was aware of the myriad of mascots and the history that had taken place over the years. He was also educated by Coach Hogue, who was his predecessor, and also then Mayor Milano, about the connection to the bomber squadron. And Coach McPherson, I think, was ahead of his time in the early 1980s, and I believe he made a conscious effort to abandon the use of Native American symbolism. And that's why folks like myself and others that are on the Transparency Initiative, people that grew up in the 1980s who don't have that association with Native American symbolism, that's why we feel so strongly that this isn't a straightforward issue where we've always had this connection or this connotation that can't be split away from the nickname. In fact, Coach McPherson picked an emblem that you've probably seen on banners or pendants of a masked, caped bandit, similar to the Texas Tech Red Raiders. At some later time, while Jason was in school in the 90s, not his choice, I think we saw that symbolism come back. And that's when, I don't like to commingle the cultural appropriation with the racist caricature, but it was in the 90s particularly that the use of the racist caricature took place. And I met Mr. Burke, who was the principal, several years ago, and he told me about how in 1999, when he came into the high school, he saw that caricature on the window as you enter the main lobby, and he instantly or immediately requested that it be taken down, and he recognized it as being inappropriate, and that was the direction that the school took. At or about the same time, Coach Morris, our head football coach, was out in Utah and saw the symbol used by the University of Utah Utes, which is not a dream catcher, as we sometimes say, but it's a war drum on its side with feathers. And obviously Utah has the letter U. We in Melrose adopted and then adapted that with the letter M. That practice continued until about February of 2016, when at the request of the Human Rights Commission, various leaders in the community met in Mayor Dolan's office. Mr. Merrill was there, as was I, and representatives from the Parks Commission and the Human Rights Commission and Superintendent Tamor. Conversation took place, and it was agreed that the use of any and all Native American symbolism should be abandoned immediately, but that the name, the Red Raiders, which predates the use of any symbolism, was not racist in nature, was certainly not racist in its origins, and that we could move on without that. That is a way longer version than what I promised. I apologize, but that sums up the history of the use of the nickname and symbols in Melrose.
That was super helpful, but if you speak to what it is you want to get out of tonight, what are
Sure.
your objectives? Why are you here tonight?
So one of the things, I've been involved in this conversation for about 6 or 7 years, and one of the things that I find particularly frustrating, at least especially in the last couple of years, and this has nothing to do with Mr. Merrill, this has to do with the wider community. It seems to me that the people who want to keep the name the Red Raiders are not listening to the reasons why people who want to change the name think the name should be changed. Simultaneously, the people who want to change the name, they're not listening to the people who don't want the name to change. So what I hope to accomplish this evening, and more broadly through this process, is for a conversation to take place and for folks to see that Mr. Merrill and I, who are friends and respect each other, are able to have a conversation with differing opinions, and that we can talk about this and we can get somewhere.
Thank you. And Jason, to you as well. Why are you here tonight?
Thanks, Sam, and thank you, Ward, for the invitation and for putting this together and setting this all up. And that's an interesting question. I wasn't invited to be here, so I think since that I've been able to think about that a little bit. Again, Ward put it very well, and I think there's certainly a lot of lack of people listening to one another, and sometimes a lack of civility and respect. And I think this isn't the first time Ward and I have had a conversation about the mascot, or have had differing opinions about it. It's never ended with anything but a handshake and say hello to your kids, et cetera. So I think that's an important piece to it, and job well done by getting this going by both of you and having us here tonight. And certainly I think on a greater picture, what got us to here is after a lot of thought, certainly writing a letter to our school community that I think it's time to move away from it. And I think the question is, and I just to go back, I would say I agree with everything Ward said about the history of the mascot throughout the history of Melrose High School, which dates back to 1858. And we made a conscious effort to kind of reinstate the Block M, and that's not going anywhere. But I think the question is that we have to think about is that, where's kind of the threshold for the fact at one point that the Red Raider was certainly connected with and associated with what is, whether you want to consider it certainly offensive or racist imagery of the cartoon character for sure, and kind of some other imagery that, certainly I don't think we were looking to, in an honorable way or a connection with Native Americans or indigenous folks. So I think that we have to think about, the effects on that. And certainly, I have a unique perspective, wake up every morning and give thanks for where I live, where I went to school, the position I have. I hold a tremendous responsibility that I don't take lightly, and the number one piece of that responsibility is the safety and welfare of all the students at the high school. It's not just the majority of them, it's not a few, it's not a certain group, but it's all of them every year, and there's 1,000 different, a different combination of 1,000 kids every year. So, and it's a unique perspective, having walked the halls when I was, 16 and 17 years old too, so.
Right. Well, thank you.
Thanks.
So, as I mentioned in the beginning, we did, the Transparency Initiative did solicit for questions through the Melrose Weekly newspaper. I have the printout here. There are 8 pages full of them. 2 pages for Ward, no offense, 6 pages for Jason, much offense. So, but I'm going to do my best to honor the questions that were submitted, the sentiment that they are they're portraying. A lot of them are around, past decisions that were made back 6 years ago with a whole different school committee, practically, except for Margaret was on there. And, you know, I want to be mindful that we are talking about 2022 and a school committee that looks today like it is, just inaugurated on Monday. There are some questions in here about symbols and the symbols that had changed over time, which I feel like Ward has sufficiently just addressed and answered. There were some questions in here about motivation and motivation in the process, and who gets to decide what the process is. And of course, there are lots of questions about swag and how do we buy new stuff. So we will try to address all of those as best we can. But I would love to start with Mr. Merrill, if you could please explain to those who are watching and to me what you believe the process is this time in order to, that under your, what you believe the process to be in order to make the change that you had described in your email on August 2nd.
Okay, thanks. So, again, I'll clarify, just glancing through some questions that may fit into this as well. And certainly, this was my email. If someone else put me up to it, wrote it, it certainly would have sounded a lot better than it did. But this is me as the leader of this building and school community, and going into my 6th year. After having some thought, this was the time. This is where I felt in my heart and got that it was time to put this out there and say what I believe in the direction I think we should go. So that this, I wasn't put up to this or asked or encouraged to do this by anyone. Having some pretty good idea of beforehand, certainly I made certain people that I answer to, the school committee and superintendent, aware that I was going to write it. I think my wife knew as well for a day or so, but at the time I know who the voting body on this is the school committee in any town or city. So I know that they're going to have the say, and if there's a change in the makeup of a school mascot nickname, just the mascot, just the imageries, colors, or anything like that, they're going to vote on that. So far, the process, I outlined that to our school community and probably much of the community at that point within a few hours. And then as the school year started, invited any students and staff members to be part of conversations in the process. All students were emailed. We started what we call a Mascot Steering Committee, which is just a group of people that came together to kind of think about criteria for the new mascot, how we can elicit ideas, how we can get ideas from the greater community, ideas from all the elementary schools and middle school and parents and high school students. And we asked all of our students and staff to be on it, and anyone that asked or replied or came to be part of it has been allowed to be part of it. So no one has not been able to be part of that. And a couple times we've had some information sessions too, where we've reached out to all students in the school to come share any thoughts, ideas, concerns, opposing ideas, new ideas, ways to reach more people, just to hear updates. So we did that as recent as yesterday. So, and some earlier in the fall. So we put out a survey, as you know, and with the idea of let's get as many ideas as possible, and with the intention of, at some point, having an idea of a new mascot that meets the criteria that was set, that we can propose to the school committee. And at that time, they're the voting body on that.
And so that brings us to at what date will this committee, I believe, there to provide the recommendations for the school committee to vote? So where is that in our timeline?
We don't have a date, but
okay.
We had said that we hope to do that in the second half of the year, in the spring semester. So we're continuing to kind of vet all of those ideas that were brought in, all kinds of wide variety of ideas to the criteria, and kind of building the next process for how we can gather feedback to continue to narrow those down and see what everyone feels would fit as a potential new mascot or nickname or both.
Wonderful. So, Ward, that feels pretty robust, but here we are with the transparency initiative, you know, not focusing so much on the public information request, all the details, if you would please. But what part of that process that he just described are you, would you have hoped would be a different, better,
I got you.
yeah.
Sure, thank you. So certainly the process that Mr. Merrill put into motion was genuine and heartfelt and came from a good place. And it would be false to suggest that we think anyone put him up to it. I don't think that at all. The first problem or issue that we have with that process is something that I've been talking about for years, which is the very first question that should be asked is, should the name change? And in asking that question, we need to examine, yes, there was a period in which an offensive or racist caricature was used, but certainly not for the entire 60 years, 60 years? 80 years. 80 years that Native American symbolism was used. It wasn't the whole time. And so the first question that should be asked is, does the name need to be changed? Is the association between that symbol or that use of an offensive caricature and the name Red Raiders, are they inextricably connected? Are they able to be separated? Could they be reinvented in a non-racist way as they were in the beginning, to quote a local community member? That is the first question that I believe very strongly should be asked, is do we have to change the name? And so I guess in a very fundamental way, that's where I disagree with Mr. Merrill. I wish that there was a way to have that conversation. I wish, and I hope that we could still have that conversation. And as we're doing tonight, we're taking on the history head on. We're not skipping past what happened or what we think happened, and we're talking about it. Sorry, got my back turned to you. So that's the first and most fundamental issue. And then also, we disagree very strongly. The process, I certainly respect Mr. Merrill's perspective that he's conducting a process and that he understands that ultimately it'll be the decision of the school committee, first, whether the name needs to change, and secondly, whether or not they affirm his recommendation or go with something else. I get that, but that's really not what creating policy is. Creating policy is the process, and it's examining, particularly in this case, their budget implications. If there's going to be a new mascot, what's the plan for rollout? Is there a cost associated or involved? Is there any input sought from the community? And I understand that there was a survey that was taken, and through a FOIA request, we received a response that showed that the broader community outside of the school overwhelmingly supported or wanted to keep the name the way it is. And what I suggest that tells us is that we're not engaging the community, the broader community, adequately. And so we're doing that tonight. And I hope that there will be other opportunities for the broader community, the wider Melrose community, to provide input and share with the school committee and others that will be the decision makers. And that's not my personal opinion, that's the guidance of the Mass Association of School Committees. So while I certainly have a tremendous amount of respect for Mr. Merrill and what he's trying to accomplish, we differ when it comes to what the proper process or procedure would be.
Right, so if I could follow up with that. So I'm a Florida Gator, so I love football. It just comes with the package. But with that said, in your presentation and in your speech tonight, every time something changed, it was done, I don't know if it was done unilaterally, it wasn't there, but it was done by the behest of Coach X, Coach Y.
Right.
And so, with that said, how do you perceive that conversation and that process going of how, or do we have to change?
Right.
How do you perceive that to go in 2022?
You mean, who do we seek input from?
Or how do we have the conversation? Or how do we, help me out here, like,
Yeah, I think we...
who decides, or how does that decision made?
Sure. I don't mean to turn my
No,
to
you're
you.
good.
So we're living in a pandemic, and we're doing the best we can, and that certainly limits our ability to engage in a public forum, but, you know, this is America, and we seek input from people publicly.
Mm-hmm.
We give people an opportunity to come forward and speak, and there could be people that come forward that say, you know, the highlight of my life was going to Melrose High School, and I take a tremendous amount of pride in that name. It's part of my identity. Maybe they don't articulate it that way, but it's who they are. It's very important to them. There may be people in our community who come forward that say, the use of what I perceive to be a name with Native American connotations upsets me. But we haven't heard from people in the community that say that. We haven't heard from people in the community who say, I'm proud to be a Red Raider. We haven't created a vehicle for that to take place, right? So it's great that we're here talking tonight. It's a great first step, but I'd like to see a larger conversation. I'd like to think about ways that we can seek input from a wider, you know, range of folks.
So one of the questions that was asked was about majority, the majority rule or the majority vote. But Jason, when you and I spoke Sunday about who decides, or how do we decide if it's time, or if it's culturally insensitive, or do we need to evolve or change what's perceived to be or what is offensive? You had a very different answer.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what my answer was, but I'll say it's complicated, and, you know, to some of Ward's points as well as yours, it's complicated. At what point, who's that to judge? So for me, this is what I can say. There's 1,000 kids over there, and if this doesn't make one kid feel good, if one kid feels unwelcome, then the principal of the high school says it's not okay. And that's where I stand as the principal of the high school. And I hope people can kind of respect that end of it. I don't ask everyone to agree with it for certain, but, you know, a younger kid recently said to me, if it's something you have to think about and question, I think you get your answer. So I think for me, that's where it is. You know, one kid is too many.
So there's room for conversation around tradition and how people feel one way, the other way, and always in between about the current nickname. But to you, just to underscore, you believe that if even just one student or one person that is associated with your building feels that it is not, they don't feel welcomed here, or it does give the connotation back to the period in time when it was cultural appropriation of the mascot and so on, where it does allude back to that time for one student, that's enough evidence for you.
Yeah, I mean, within reason. That's why I got to this point and wrote this letter. And that's where I fight as the principal of the building. But I certainly think it's appropriate that we're thinking about this, and at what point. And I think hearing where people are at, and I think we assume we know where people always believe, and I think in 2022 more than ever, and I think Ward would agree with me, people oftentimes assume what other people are thinking, and because you thought one way on one subject, you must think this way on the other. And that's not always fair. So I think really getting an understanding of where people are at is always going to help decision makers make their decisions. I'm not voting on this. I'm proposing something that I think is right for the school and is more in line. It's not the first time that the parents that are in the room have read this and heard me say it, that our number one goal since I became the principal at the high school is to create and sustain a welcome environment built on kindness and respect. If you ask any kid in the building, what do we care about around here? They go, oh, be kind, be respectful, treat each other well. And that's what we talk about. I don't know if having a mascot that was formally associated with offensive imagery is in line with that goal.
So this one point in between you is one thing that I've heard that is still, I don't want to say far enough apart, but still far apart where you still feel, Ward, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there does need to be at least some, again, conversation, some commemoration of history, but knowing that also it's two sides of this coin, like how do we then move forward if this is the direction that our administrator is going?
Yeah, I think a better response would be to say, this is the first time I've heard that. And that would be the first time that anyone publicly that has an opinion or a thought on the subject would become aware of that perspective. And so I think that underscores the importance of a public process, and a process in which a student, if they're comfortable with it, can come forward and say, I feel uncomfortable, and whether they come forward or not, Mr. Merrill can make the statement that he just made and bring awareness to a community. The process, which took place over the last several months, has been in the school with, in the group making the decisions or conducting the process. It's been, behind closed doors. It's not known what's being talked about. And sometimes it's that unknown that
Right.
that contributes or adds a little bit of fuel to the fire.
Right.
So, hopefully it's been apparent over the last few months in different statements that we've made that, calling for transparency, knowing what's going on and knowing what's being talked about. And certainly I value what Mr. Merrill just said. I mean, it has worth. It means something. We can't know that unless we have an open process and
Right.
a conversation.
Right. And although Melrose is very unique, being the center of the universe, did you hear me at home? I think we're not the only ones going through this right now.
Sure.
A lot of communities are struggling with, honoring where our identity has been in our history, and also being able to move forward and embrace change incrementally, possibly.
Right.
And so, but I think, coming to this table, meeting you both really kind of for the first time recently, I have been very sensitive to, and I hear you when you are telling me that the ability to feel heard and actually have this conversation is very important. And so, insofar as, I guess, the process moving forward, what things would you like to see moving forward to get us moving forward together? It's a lot of moving, but I got there. I landed the plane.
Moving right along. I'd love to see a public conversation, a forum take place. I don't know exactly how I would format that, but I'd love to have a conversation with Mr. Merrill, representatives from the Melrose Public Schools, the school committee, who ultimately will make the decision. I'd like to have a conversation about, I feel very strongly that if we don't handle this correctly and we force a process where the conversation never happens and we change the nickname and we adopt a mascot. Technically, we've never had a mascot. I just feel like there'll be bad blood there. There'll be something latent. There'll be an undercurrent that there's a high likelihood that it's going to crop up again in the future. So let's deal with this thing head on. Let's talk about it. As Mr. Merrill, I keep wanting to say Jason, but as Mr. Merrill.
Jason's fine.
He's not Mr. Merrill to me yet.
Yeah, Jason's quite
Yeah,
fine.
that's all right, but I need to. So we need to give a voice to people like that student that have questions, that have concerns. We need to publicize what the history is. We need to talk about, and I think it's not a small point that, almost 6 years ago, in February of 2016, we met and talked about this, and I'm actually proud to say that the Melrose Public Schools have been at the forefront of dealing with these issues head on. 23 years ago when Mr. Burke came in, that was it. He saw that cartoon caricature and he said that it's completely inappropriate. That practice ceased immediately.
So that, if you don't mind me interrupting.
Yep.
That did not include a public process.
I wasn't here at the time. No,
Were you?
no, I was in
Oh.
New York. But
But the way you described that,
Sure.
and that being okay,
I don't, for all I know, he may have gone through proper channels with
Yeah.
the school committee. I don't know. I don't know what the proper process was.
but it seems to be okay with you from a historic perspective, that a unilateral.
Well, it's the
decision-
history. I can't change it. Okay, so,
Uh-oh.
but I mean, all right, so in 1999, a new principal came in. He saw an offensive caricature of a Native American, very unflattering. I don't know the process that he went through. I would imagine that, had he gone through a proper process, there might have been some people who disagreed, but ultimately I would think that, good judgment would prevail, and that symbol would go away, and it would be and it ultimately was changed. I can't speak to the process that took place, but there's also such a thing as things being a little more clear-cut, right, in some instances than others. And in this particular case, sorry, this isn't so clear-cut, right? If we went back to, the early part of the 20th century, before 1955, it would have been clear to someone in Melrose High School, which was a building that stood right where we are right now, we're the Red Raiders. Okay, is that connected to Native American, or they might have said Indians? What are you talking about? They wouldn't have known what you meant. Some of those people are still alive, right? And some of the people like us in the 1980s that didn't have that connection, we have a connection or an affinity towards the name. It judge us how you will. It's part of our identity. We're proud to be here. The folks that are on the Transparency Initiative, any one of us could live in any other community, right? We choose to live here. We love this community. And being a Red Raider is part of our identity. Mm-hmm. So it's no small thing. Similarly, for existing students, right? Not all students, right? But there certainly are some students who think of themselves as a Melrose Red Raider. Well, now all of a sudden you say, well, you're not a Melrose Red Raider. That's a bad thing. I don't understand. Okay, well, what you are is something that's bad, and it needs to be changed. I don't know. I feel like, especially in this time where we're coming on 2 years of a pandemic, we're talking constantly about the emotional and health and well-being of our students. And this is no criticism of this guy, because I know he cares about this more than anyone, but this is my opinion and perspective is there is a way that we could do this and have this conversation so that you don't have 190 kids sign a petition that was presented to the school committee last night that says, we want to stay the Red Raiders. Okay, there's a disconnect, right, in the process if that's happening. And we can't just point a finger at this guy,
Right.
because I know he's doing his best. But there's a disconnect there. There's a conversation. There's something that has to happen. What that is, I admit I don't completely know, but something has to happen. There's got to be some conversation where we can hash all this out.
Right. So similar question to you, Mr. Merrill. You've obviously, thank you for coming tonight. You've been invited by a group of citizens who have been very vocal, very activists in opening up this process to the greater community, the grown-ups outside of the school. Your job is to administer the business of inside the school. How do you feel there should be room made for additional voices outside? Do you feel like that should be something that is a part of this committee's jobs? I don't want to say who should be responsible for this, but do you feel that that is a thing that is still needed to happen?
I think when thinking about this, we talked about it the other day, I think I'm happy to be a part of it, just like I'm happy to be a part of this. I don't look at that as necessarily my responsibility in this. I think, the students, obviously, and our staff and our families, and certainly the students that are coming up, that are here in the middle school and at the elementary schools. But it's hard to capture. Are we looking at the community? Are we looking at alum that may be outside of the community? In our efforts to try to come up with new ideas, we certainly tried to capture that a lot. I think people in the community use that as an opportunity to say that they would want to keep the Red Raider or Red Raiders, or even bring back imagery in some cases, or keep just Raiders, and also provided some different takes on it too. And I think, I certainly was checking them on the way in. I haven't received many emails on this outside of the very beginning of August, which is, the majority of them were more supportive of change. But I certainly welcome conversations, and been able to have a few with some folks that have just happened throughout the community at different events, or just bumping into people. But I'm happy to be a part of it, but I don't know if it was my responsibility to seek out that conversation necessarily.
And you're shaking your head.
I think he's 100% right. I think that's why the school committee administers this process. I think that Jason's abilities are limited to what he can do within the four walls of the high school, so to speak. And that's why it shouldn't be a burden placed on a principal to administer and guide this process. That's why you have a school committee.
I'm trying to think of an analog to this process that, farewell, have fun in Florida. I'm trying to think of an analog in Melrose history where we did rely on our elected bodies to put forward a public process for the community to either collect enough opinions, advice, solicit enough feedback so that they can make a decision. Thinking of, of the most recent override, a lot of those, it seemed to be, a lot of those conversations happened outside. The conversations were obviously held as elected officials were invited to come. It seemed that there were conversations that organically happened, or through campaigns or whatever, that they outside had to manifest those dialogues, not necessarily our elected body. So I wonder, and then also not going back too far in history, can you think of any analog in which we've relied on our elected officials specifically to help with a forum series? There might be one. I'd love to hear if there is an analog for that.
No, I don't know of any example, but I think we can look to nearby communities like Wakefield and Tewksbury a few years ago, and we can see how when a process isn't managed properly, it can become extremely divisive.
Right.
And I'm being speculative here, but from conversations that I did have with some folks in August who were in favor of a change occurring, it was expressed to me there was a very deep concern that we don't want another Wakefield, okay? I don't know what that means, except that I know in Wakefield there's a process that resulted in a deeply divided community.
Right.
I think we're on that trajectory right now. And
Yeah.
so I don't know, except to say that I don't know if there's a good analogous situation to suggest. I just know that we're talking about changing the school mascot nickname or the school nickname, and that when that same topic has been broached in neighboring communities in recent years, or just Google the subject, Google Red Raiders, and you can see the types of things that have happened.
Right.
I appreciate, if I don't mean to insinuate that it's part of Jason's intention deliberately, but unintentionally, if the hope is that we can shelter a process and then present it to the school committee, and we can have a meeting and we can vote and we can be done with it, it doesn't feel like a very public or democratic process. And I realize that sometimes these conversations can be very difficult to have and a little scary, right, for some folks, and I
Yeah.
appreciate that. But if you want to make change, if you want to do something like this, then maybe you need to have difficult conversations.
Yep, which I am all for. But I would like, in my opinion, and I know this is not my moderation role,
You're stepping outside your role.
I always step in it.
And I'm going to Florida.
So,
I'm going to Florida then.
one of the biggest differences between Melrose and what we're trying to do here and Wakefield and what transpired there was that we actually have our leader, our high school leader, leading this charge and being pretty demonstrative on his views in moving this forward. Wakefield did not have that, and so they had a vacuum in which the school committee did the best they could to fill in. Again, these are wonderful, unpaid, hardworking volunteers,
Sure.
and I'm grateful that they do it and not me. But I want to wrap up soon because we're getting close on time.
Yep.
But so I want to say I'm optimistic that
Yep.
we can totally get through this without becoming divisive any more than we have. I think I would love to turn that corner tonight.
Well, we're not going to be able to turn that corner tonight because tonight is a first step, right? We're having a public event. But to date, this has been the extent of involvement with the broader community. It's been a survey that later, when that data was presented, it was presented with the footnote of, well, most of these are probably the same person over and over again. You know, it was the very survey that was supposed to be the gauge of, the community sentiment was immediately discounted as being invaluable or inadequate, invaluable, flawed. The extent of our involvement so far has been to go to school committee meetings and have 3 minutes to speak at public comment.
Right.
That's not a public process, and I can't say it enough, how much I appreciate everything that this guy has tried to do, but it's not enough. And we do have a divisive situation. And until this process changes and opens up to take direct input from the broader community, I mean, there could be a forum here, this forum here tonight could be hosted by the Merrill School Committee, the Merrill
Right.
Public Schools. It's not.
So in case they aren't able or don't, they are here tonight.
Mm-hmm.
So they are listening, and some are watching on TV because I can see text flying through. Would you be open to making the commitment to drive a community conversation on behalf of this issue to do this again, essentially, or to do whatever is the community feels necessary. Or as I mentioned to the audience in the beginning, if you feel like this isn't enough and you want to have your own community conversation, we can do that.
Well, I appreciate what you're suggesting. This is sort of a public comment on steroids, right? We're getting a much longer period of time to talk about what our concerns are. There needs to be something that comes back our way. And by our, I mean the broader community. There needs to be outreach of some sort, right? I've had conversations with people over the last few months who've said to me, you know, what's the scuttlebutt? What's the backroom conversation going on? What are you guys negotiating? And I said, what are you talking about? And they said, well, when you're talking behind the scenes about how you might negotiate an end to this thing, I said, there's nobody talking to us. We're might as well be speaking to the wall. I mean, we're going and making a statement. Thank you. And that's the end of it. There needs to be engagement. And I think this is a great step forward tonight. I don't know what that looks like. I think it looks similar to this. I know everybody's afraid, and rightly so, I guess, to have this big, or let me rephrase that. We all saw several years ago what happened in Tewksbury, right? Whether it was in their gymnasium or where it was a highly contentious event. People were, I don't know. I don't know if you want to say they were intimidated, if you want to say that, you can articulate it however you want, right? But as Jason said, people come to conversations, they've already got these narratives going on in their head about what somebody's thinking or doing. And I confess that I have this one that I think behind this, a lot of folks are trying to avoid that from happening. And I get that. But, you know, here we are, the leaders of this group, you know, leaders in the community that want to have this conversation. And I think we're demonstrating that we're open to a conversation. I'd like to see something come back our way from the city buying through the schools. I don't know what that is, but let's have a conversation and talk about what that could be. Maybe you find out that a ton of people in the community have strong opinions one way or the other. Maybe you find out that the vast majority aren't interested, but we don't know that. So that's where I'm coming from.
Okay, great. So I know we're coming close on time. We might be a little over. We didn't actually discuss how long this would go. Yeah. But Mr. Merrill, actually, I'm going to start with Ward again, if you don't mind.
Okay.
I don't know if you need a drink of water or if
No, I'm fine.
I'm sure you can do this all day because we have. So is there anything that I haven't asked that you would like to say? Any points that you wanted to make tonight that I did not ask you?
No, I think that you had about 8 pages of questions for Jason and you let him off the hook. And I'm teasing. That's quite all right. I think, no, what I'd like to say.
He answered most of them on his own.
I'm teasing. In closing, thank you for moderating this. Jason, thank you for all that you do for our community and for our kids. I mean that sincerely. I think you know how much, or how highly I think of you. And while we have a differing opinion on this and this process, I'll continue to think the way that I do of Jason and have tremendous amount of respect for him and be very thankful that we have him as a principal in this school and hope that we don't lose him until he retires in 50 years. Going forward, I sure hope that if there was a message that that I could impress upon others, it would be we need to have a conversation. There needs to be some dialogue that takes place about how this happens. I respect the idea that the name could be hurtful to folks, but let's talk about that. Let's talk about what that means and not have it be a secondhand thing that we hear about. Let's discuss that, and let's discuss it in context of the full history of the use of the nickname, the mascot. Several years ago, no, not that long ago, February of 2018, a gentleman who is widely known in this community, who's greatly respected, who wouldn't want to be named tonight for certain reasons, shared the history that when he uncovered the history of the origin of the Red Raiders name, and it was his opinion just a couple of years ago now, well, I guess that's going on 3 years ago, that the name wasn't racist in its origin. There's an opportunity for the students, the coaches, the teachers, and folks to reinvent what that mascot nickname means. I'd like to see us try that. I'm not against the mascot steering committee adopting a mascot, but as far as the nickname goes, I'd like to see if it's possible to do that. I'd like to see if in fact the two are inextricably connected or not. But we'll never know unless we try. And thank you. That's where I am.
Mr. Merrill, same question. Is there anything I did not ask that you wanted to make sure you mentioned?
No, in looking at the, some of the questions from beforehand, I think we tried to touch on a little of everything. So, I would say thank you for your time hosting tonight. Certainly thank you, Ward, for the invitation, putting this together and having this conversation, and for the kind words, certainly. And Ward's been a friend to myself, but also Melrose High School for a long time, and certainly with his work on the MHS Site Council for a few years before he took on this new challenge he holds now. So I appreciate that. Oh, I would say it's certainly, I'd go back and touch on, you asked Ward some questions about when, Dr. Burke had moved some symbolism and things like that. And I wasn't there at the time either. I think I was in college. But, I understand fully that this is a little bigger than that. I think we've had many symbols, certainly many different renditions of Native American imagery. Some more, maybe you'd say, someone would maybe say some more offensive than others, some more realistic looking than others. I think in 2022, we would probably consider them, myself certainly as the principal of the high school, none of them were okay. But I think this is a bigger shift and a bigger change. So I understand why this would create, lack of a better word, more controversy or more conversation, for sure. And I think the other point is, I think the majority rules, the vote type situations, I think those are tough. They're very divisive. And on the other hand, it's also hard. Things can become divisive when you don't do that as well. So I think it's an interesting concept, especially where we are at Melrose, where we're talking about formally associated
Right.
with offensive imagery, and not currently. So it makes it a little tougher. This isn't, Bill Ricker. It's a little tougher for us. I get that. And I don't take that lightly. But for me, I think it's just, we talk about a lot of things at school all day long. We talk about tradition. We talk about a lot of the people that came before, whether they were teachers or students. Some of those people are probably in this room. We talk about that with kids, whether it's in the classroom or at lunch. We talk about how we communicate with one another. We talk about being respectful. At the end of the day, it comes back to how we treat one another. And I think that's where my compass is, and that's kind of where my feeling lies with this.
Right.
So
'Cause
that's the place it's coming from.
You can't legislate civil rights on majority rule necessarily,
Yeah.
right? So I hope that made sense. So with that said, I just wanted to, one thing that people asked, last question, is what's next? Now, I think it's hard to figure that out, but I think there was an appetite for more of this is the point I want to make. Whether it's this issue or other issues, one of the questions in here was, what are you guys going to be doing next? What are you going to focus on next? We do have a lot of things to talk about in Melrose that are also important. Oh, you have an answer for that? It was facetious.
I was going to make a joke.
Oh, go ahead.
I was killed. No, I think that, I think you're asking me about the transparency initiative.
Or you personally, what else are you passionate about that will be next?
Well, on January 25th, you'll all have an opportunity to vote for a new building at Northeast Regional Vocational School. And I hope that whether you are in support of the new building or oppose it, I hope that you'll come out and vote at the middle school between 11 a.m. and 6 p.m. It's been my privilege for the last year to represent Melrose there. Northeast is Melrose's other public high school. It's not a private school. It's a fantastic institution with its own great principal and superintendent. They're very fortunate and blessed there. We've got 56 students there from Melrose now. We're averaging about 10 or 11 there a year. And in this past year, we got 27 kids from Melrose in. And I'm hoping that, during my tenure, we'll continue that trend.
You can watch all of that on last night's Let's Talk Melrose, where Ward was the guest.
Don't watch that.
Mr. Merrill, to you also, if you weren't here tonight talking about the mascot, what would you be losing sleep over? What was the
Outside
next
of
thing on your
COVID.
strategic plan?
Yeah, one, I fully support public education, so good luck with that. We support it in the Merrill House anyway. So I think in thinking that it's refreshing and difficult often to get out of COVID protocols, pandemic stuff, but I'm really proud of all the stuff that we've accomplished at the high school the past 2 years through that, and some good changes we've made in how we're supporting all students, and some universal screeners we've put in to help with social emotional well-being as well as academic success and stuff like that. So I think right now we're in the midst of getting ready for any changes, tweaks and changes to the program of studies for next year. But like when you asked that the other day, and I think about all the adults in the room, certainly I'm thinking about the growth of our senior internship project that we've had for many years now, but it's grown to the point where all of our seniors, 240-something of them, are going to be going out on internships and doing different projects within the school and within our community. So I think about how we can grow some new opportunities and partner with our community members. So I think that'll be a great conversation with some folks in town.
That's awesome.
Thanks.
Well, I'm going to turn it back out to the audience before we close, and just everybody could think for a moment again about why you came here tonight. What is it that you wanted to get out of this? What did you want to hear? And with a show of hands, and luckily people on TV can't see, do you feel that you gleaned something new that made you think in a different way about the conversation that we had tonight before you walked in the door? Raise your hand if you were more satisfied about living in this city of Melrose. Oh, here they come. Okay, that's almost unanimous, which is good enough. Well, thank you so much again for doing this. I'm very grateful that this was put together. I was honored to be here. Regardless of where I fell in your number of choices, I feel like I knocked it out of the park. And on behalf of everyone who's in the building and everyone at home, thank you so much for tuning in. If you feel like your questions weren't satisfied, that you sent in, or have other questions, or please reach out to either of our panelists personally. Sorry to do that. Thank you for your patience, as always. This is the first of many difficult conversations we're going to have in Melrose that we're going to continue. So be patient as we move forward together. Stay well, and I guess we'll see you around town. Thank you.